So, good evening to all. This is the first meeting of the Center for Legal Studies, Brazil, United States, at the UFMG. It's an honor to have you all with us, and especially Professor Regilson Vitorelli. Most of you know him. He is a professor at UFMG, and Professor Mortimer Sellers from the University of Baltimore. There are some books for sale here, on sale, and Professor Vitorelli will be pleased, I guess, to sign your books after the meeting. Professor Vitorelli is Professor Aziz, please join us. Professor Vitorelli is professor at UFMG Law School. He has a SJD from the Universidade Federal of Paraná. He was awarded in 2019 with the Mauro Capelletti Book Prize of Best Book in Legal Procedure in the world. It's a big prize. And he's also a circuit judge in Minas Gerais. And Professor Sellers is a Regent Professor at the Maryland Educational System. He has a JD from Harvard and a PhD from Oxford. And he was the former head of the IVR, and he's also a lawyer in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Well, Professor Vitorelli will present his book on the Brazilian Supreme Court, and then Professor Mortimer Sellers will make his remarks and questions, and then we will discuss in a free way. So anyone who wants to make questions, you have your time to it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My dear friend Marcelo Galupo. Good evening to you all, my friend Aziz. It was very nice from you to organize this event. I'm very pleased to meet Professor Mortimer Sellers and to present you with a little bit of what I've written in this last few years. My first idea on
just are you listening to us, Tim?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Clearly.
So my first idea with this book was to initiate a dialogue with people that are English speakers. We write and we talk in Portuguese, and Portuguese is not a very common language. Even people from Spain and Eastern American are very displeased with reading and talking and knowing Portuguese technical literature. And this was a difficulty that I have noticed in the last few years, and I have always tried to bridge this gap. So in 2018, I came across something that astonished me. It was a test, Professor Seller, that was presented in a magazine in Brazil called Veja, in which you could answer a quiz to know which justice you were. So this was a very interesting thing, because I always considered that people were interested in knowing which Marvel superhero they were, but not which justice from the Supreme Court they should be. And so I wrote a book on the Brazilian Supreme Court for laymen, from the laymen in Brazil. So people who were not lawyers could read about the Supreme Court, and I published this book in 2019. And so people were very interested, and I gave many lectures in many law schools and other places to newcomers to the law school, and talking about this wonderful phenomenon that is we are all talking about Supreme Courts right now. And then I translated or made a version of this book for the non-Brazilian reader. This is the story of the book. But the question that was so important to me is, why are Supreme Courts so important and popular nowadays? Because they have always been important, but now they are also popular. People, common people, are talking about Supreme Courts and what they do and how they have decided and what they should do and shouldn't do. And this is actually, at least for us, a very new phenomenon. And I know, and I think Professor Sellers is going to talk a little bit about this. This is also a phenomenon in the US. So people are protesting in front of the Supreme Court, and people took the court to the streets. And this is something very new to us. So this is a picture from the Brazilian Supreme Court. I also added some pictures in my books for the foreign reader to know it. So this is the main room of our Supreme Court. And there are, of course, many answers to the question of why we are talking so much about our Supreme Court in Brazil. So now this is a version of the Brazilian Supreme Court. And I present some kind of multiple explanations to why we are talking so much about the Supreme Court. So the first thing to know about Brazil is that we have a very long constitution. There are too many provisions. Our constitution, as Professor Sellers, I'm sure knows from his past visits to Brazil, is a small book. It's not a few pages. It's a small book and not so small. So there are many things that have to do with the Constitution, and the Constitution talks about many things, including sports and culture and indigenous peoples and healthcare and education. So if we have a long constitution, it's quite natural that we are going to have a lot of constitutional cases. Secondly, we have a constitution that's full of open standards. And so it's not only a long constitution, it's also an open constitution. So we also have due process clause, we also have liberty clause, we also have equal protection clause. So and these are very open standards that can be interpreted in many ways. So it's quite easy to take a case for the Supreme Court, to the Supreme Court in Brazil. And then let's take a look on how easy it is. We have now a panel that's called Open Court, in which you can look the numbers of cases that we have in Brazil. This is as of today. So these are the cases that have been ruled on this year as of today. I have reached for these numbers this morning. So today is the 21st of March. We have so far 17,342 rulings of the court this year. And so if we project this for the rest of the year, it's possible that we are going to be at the same average we have been in the last few years, around 80,000 to 100,000 rulings of the court. And we are including here both single judge's decision, a single justice decision, and also rulings of the full bench of the court, and also rules of the two panels that the court has. So it's a lot. It's from any perspective. The Brazilian Supreme Court decides more in a year than the United States Supreme Court has decided in all its history. So this is a very complicated phenomenon. And of course, this is something that's going to trouble us, because now it's difficult to follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. It's difficult to carry on any analysis of what the Supreme Court is doing, even though it's quite transparent. You can go at the website and find information that's very up to date. So it's important and interesting in this regard. There's a fourth explanation that is the failures of the other branches of government. We live in a society that has been much disenchanted about the executive and the legislature. And this is a problem that's going to be that's been addressed more or less. There's been academic debates and also political debates on what the judiciary and the legislative and the executive should do and how the relationship of these branches should be. But there's so far no conclusion. So the judiciary is actually gaining more and more space because the other two branches are simply not properly functioning, and they have many corruption scandals, and they have many problems with inefficiency. And so it's easier maybe for a judge to just say, do it, and not to debate in the legislature and not to have to endure the budgetary concerns that the executive has to deal with. So it's kind of maybe the wrong answer to the right problem. Instead of correcting the problems that the legislature and the executive branch have, we prefer to defer their decisions and their difficult decisions to the judicial branch. And there is also one very curious phenomenon that many cases filed in our Supreme Court, many of the most important cases filed in our Supreme Court are cases that are filed by political parties. So the parties complain because the judiciary is deciding a lot of political issues, but the parties are the ones who are inviting the judiciary to decide about political issues. So this is a paradox that has so far not been quite resolved. And then we have, of course, the counter-majoritarian concern. And many people are today talking about the problem of the Supreme Court deciding things that should be decided by the executive branch or the legislative branch. The problem, as Justice Jackson put in 1943, is that the sole point of having a Bill of Rights, of having a constitution, is exactly not to depend on the legislature to deal with some problems. So it's also paradoxical that we are discussing these problems if the Brazilian Constitution has all these provisions. So maybe the Constitution shouldn't talk about sports, shouldn't talk about culture, healthcare, or education. Maybe, but it does. So what can we do? Can we say, oh, but the judiciary shouldn't decide? But why not? It's in the Constitution. And many of these provisions are quite clear. So this is quite difficult. There is no simple answer here. And then the very last ingredient, Professor Sellers, is the media. We have been an unprecedented media exposure of the court. Every time I gave this lecture, I tell my students, it's impossible for you to go to access the three main news websites in Brazil any day of the year and not find at least one Supreme Court information or case or something in one of them. So I took my own challenge and looked today at Folha, Estadão, and Globo. And what did I find? One report about the Supreme Court and the case of the island of Fernando de Noronha. So it's a challenge. You can do it every day. Every day you go to UOL, Estadão, and Globo. Every day you will find something about the Supreme Court. It's absolutely unprecedented. And the Supreme Court at least I would say, do not dislike what's happened. I don't know if they like, but I think they at least don't dislike, because they created a state broadcast, which is called TV Justiça, in which you can watch every day everything that's happening at the Supreme Court live from the main room, and then interviews with the judges and broadcasts and so on and so forth. So it's quite outstanding from our historical perspective that now you can sitting in your house, you can be seated in your house and watch what the justices are saying. And many people discuss in Brazil if this is good, if this is bad, the good aspects and the bad aspects, but it's surely a factor that is interfering with how much the public knows about the Supreme Court and wants to debate and to talk about the Supreme Court. On the one hand, we can say that this is good. This is transparency, and this is the possibility of the public giving the court their impressions and engage into a productive and democratic discussion of the cases that are being presented at the court. So this is not bad. Nevertheless, there are some bad things regarding this. This is a graffiti I found in São Paulo around 2018. It's a bridge with a graffiti saying "Fora STF," so out with the Supreme Court. And then this is quite remarkable that someone is so interested in the Supreme Court to do a graffiti in a bridge and say with the Supreme Court. And then we would say, wow, this is some law student disenchanted with law, with legal studies that went to graffiti. But as we regrettably saw on television in the beginning of this year, we had an attack in Brasilia, a very regrettable attack to the main buildings of our state. And one of the main targeted buildings in this attack was the Supreme Court. So these are two pictures of the attack of the Supreme Court, and this is the same room that we saw in the first picture, and there's another one. So this was very, very troubling image to see. I think we all saw this on TV, and we were all very troubled with what we saw. So this is the new chapter of the story. I tried to talk about the story with dealing with its characters. So in the book, I talk about who are the justices, how they decide, and something about their political leanings. So in the US, it's common to see this kind of analysis. So if the justices are more far on the right, more far on the left, and so on. In Brazil, this is quite difficult to do because the analyses are much more nuanced. Just to have a notice, this is an analysis made by a magazine, a legal magazine in Brazil that's called Conjur, and they had to differentiate from areas of the law, and they tried to characterize how the justices are in each area of the law. And even though they tried to do lots of nuanced analysis, this was very controversial, and many justices didn't like how they were labeled by the magazine, and so on. So they apologized, and this was really controversial. So it's not that easy, and this is why I opted in the book. I opt to talk about cases. So I talk about some curiosities, but also you can go. About cases. So it's easier for me to explain, and for the reader, I think, to grasp what the Supreme Court has been doing this last 5 years, maybe, by reading a summary of its cases. So I chose 16 cases to present in the book. And then I also made the quiz, because I present the majority, the minority, and the book has a table in which you can mark. If you guys that are have the book here, you can look in the last page. You have a table in which you can sign with which justices you agree in each case and find out which justice you are. I took, by the way, the Veja test. And this is my result from the Veja test. So maybe this will talk about me. I don't know. I don't know if the test is quite accurate, but well, I would like to believe it is, because I like the justices with which I have been identified, and I don't like the other ones. So this was nice for me. And lastly, this is the last one, what we can learn from a comparison and from knowing a little bit more about Supreme Courts in other countries. So I think Supreme Courts are going to be even more susceptible to public scrutiny in the next years. And this is a problem, because judging has always been about a combination of personal conviction and interpretation of the law. However, the counter-majoritarian personal convictions are going to be progressively more difficult to maintain, because they're going to be progressively more scrutinized and publicized. And so I think maybe the liberal justices in the next few years will have a hard time, because they are going to be more and more scrutinized by the majority, because they will be on TV all the time and on the news all the time. And some like this and some don't. So I think this will be problematic. We also have even more problematic cases like Poland, like Hungary, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, which are cautionary tales about the judicial independence. The International Congress on Procedural Law this year, which will be in Peru, is about judicial independence. So there is an international concern with judicial independence. There's also a concern with conservative activism. Activism is a word that has been linked to liberal convictions in the last decades, but now you have in the Supreme Court of the United States, a conservative activism with justices that are targeting previous liberal precedents to overrule them. So we have a new phenomenon that is a conservative activism inside the court. And in Brazil, we have a cautionary tale for the relationship between the court and the people. It was very common in the last few years to say that what the court decides is about the Constitution. It's not about the people. It's not about the majority. It's about the law. This is a discourse that is going to be quite difficult to maintain in the next few years, because the court is being scrutinized by the people, even though the people is not able to grasp all the eccentricities of the law. We are going to have to deal with this new phenomenon, and maybe the legal academia has something to do about this. Maybe we will have a mission to educate people so as they can at least understand what's at stake when the Supreme Court is ruling, for example, on indigenous peoples and their rights. So for you guys that are here, thank you very much. For you guys that are watching online, this is the QR code for the Kindle version of the book, so as you can find it online. Professor Sellers, thank you very, very much for your patience and attention. I really hoped you were here to engage in this conversation, and also to eat a feijão tropeiro with us after this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vitorelli, for your presentation. It was very enlightening, very interesting. So, Professor Sellers, the room is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with my admired friend, Professor Marcelo Galuppo, with Professor Edelson Vitorelli, and with my many, many dear friends at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. It's a pleasure to be with you electronically, but as Professor Vitorelli has said, I hope next time we shall be together in person to share some food, some drink, and even more conversation. So let me say again how very, very honored I am to be in the company of Professor Edelson Vitorelli and to have the opportunity to discuss his most interesting book, a book which has now been published in English. And I'm very grateful that this book is now in English, because I think that Brazil and the United States have many similarities. So speaking as a citizen of the United States, we benefit a great deal from knowing each other. Yet we in the United States, to our great shame, we cannot speak Portuguese very well. And this book in English will be of great value to students of comparative constitutional law in the United States, but not only in the United States, in the whole world. But since I am from the United States, I want to begin by stressing some of the similarities that make this particularly important for us. And I'm talking now about the big similarities between our two nations. Our size, first of all, we're both large nations, our democracy, our diversity, our history of colonial life, and slavery. All these are things we share. And in my case, and I think in the case of many of my fellow citizens, our great affection for Brazil, our great affection for Brazil. We love Brazil. We love to be in Brazil, and we love our Brazilian colleagues. So all of these things draw us to study your institutions and to study the way you do things in Brazil. That's really the main reason I'm so happy to be here today. So I first became involved with the Supreme Court of Brazil in 1998, when I organized the Brazil-United States Administration of Justice Project. And the purpose of that initiative was to bring US federal judges to Brazil and to bring Brazilian judges to the United States. Because I saw then, and this fascinating book confirms it, I saw then that not only are Brazil and the United States similar in many ways, but they are converging. They're becoming more similar. And in particular, since 1988, and particularly and especially in our judicial institutions. And this is not surprising. I think it's not surprising at all. Once Brazil had its new constitution, once you had the new constitution in 1988, because when a nation and a judiciary have made a commitment to justice, to the rule of law, to the common good, to liberty, to human rights, and indeed with all of these to the principles of constitutionalism, the idea of being a constitutional republic. When a state has made these commitments, the states that have made these commitments will inevitably converge with each other. They will inevitably look to each other. They will be inspired by each other. So Professor Edelson Vitorelli in this book looks back, and he looks back at the beginning to some of the former differences that people might have perceived between civil law jurisdictions and common law jurisdictions. Because when one thinks of Brazil, one thinks of a civil law background. When one thinks of the United States, you think of a common law background. And indeed, some people used to believe, and I think sometimes still believe, that there is really a different conception of judges, or there was a different conception of judges, how civil law judges were viewed, how some people thought civil law judges were not able to exercise discretion in a way that common law judges did. But of course, both in civil law and in common law jurisdictions, even in earlier times, the law had to be interpreted. It has always been necessary to interpret the law. What has changed now, I think, perhaps, is not so much that judges must interpret the law, but that it is possible to interpret the law without fear, to interpret the law without fear, to interpret the law in the interest of justice. And if you go back in the history of common law countries, for example, Britain, King Charles of Britain used to say that judges were lions under the throne. His judges were lions under the throne, by which he meant he could release them to attack his enemies at any time. The judges were instruments of power, instruments of executive power. These are the judges of despots and of dictators. But in a republic, in a constitutional republic committed to justice, committed to the public good, independent judges will interpret the laws according to the principles of justice. This is their mission. So it is the underlying principles of justice that make it possible to interpret the Constitution and the laws correctly. So the vital importance of these principles, which are present in every Republican constitution. So judges have to attend to the purpose of the constitutional republic, and that is liberty, that is justice for everybody, not just for a few, not just for the rulers, but for all citizens, and indeed all people. So I think that the purpose and mission and even the technique of Brazilian and United States judges is converging, because in fact they have a very similar mission. And this is true not only of Brazil and the United States, it's true of all the constitutional republics, France, the United Kingdom, Italy. And just as Brazilian and United States judges know each other, or should know each other, that's why I brought them to see each other, just as they should know each other and know each other's work and speak to each other and learn from each other, so do those in all constitutional republics. So in fact, today, and indeed for the last 30 or 40 years, we have gatherings where constitutional court judges or Supreme Court judges from different nations meet each other and talk and share ideas, and they read each other's opinions. And this is what we call comparative constitutionalism. And this is an incredibly valuable exercise. Really, it's global constitutionalism, because there's one big discourse. It's a shared enterprise. It's an overlapping enterprise. And that is what this book contributes to so well. It makes the experience of Brazil available to many people who might not otherwise easily have understood the experience of Brazil. So this book is an excellent contribution to this global conversation. First, just by giving us a general introduction to Brazilian law and to Brazilian legal history and the organization of the Brazilian judiciary, the judicial branch in Brazil. But then showing us how the Supremo Tribunal Federal, the Supreme Court of Brazil, how it is in fact changing Brazil. Even today, how is it influencing the country more perhaps than it ever has before? And it does so because it attends to these general standards. It attends to and helps to define them and helps to make them known to the people of Brazil. So the prominence of the court gives it the opportunity to articulate the principles that should be shared, in fact, by every citizen in the Brazilian Republic. So they can look to the court to articulate these general standards, these legal principles, which we can apply in our own lives and our own behavior, and which in fact the other instruments of the state can apply. But it's the court who makes them aware, perhaps, makes them more aware of what it is they are meant to be doing. So, as you so wisely and correctly said, statutes cannot and should not anticipate every possible future situation. It's absolutely impossible to do this. One shouldn't even try. And in fact, it is misleading and confusing and leads to error if we do try. So in Brazil, I think it has been a very nice development, really, since 1988. You can see, I think, a progress. You can see a constant thinking through of these important principles. But there are, you identify some relics of the past, perhaps, that may sometimes weaken the court, some institutions that are still present or memories that are still present that make it harder to be successful. So for example, the superabundance of appeals. It may be that we have too many appeals, and it would be good to perhaps in some circumstances have fewer. And also in some cases, the procedure could be more elaborate than is absolutely necessary. And in both these circumstances, it could lead to a delay of justice. So I think one of the great concerns for Brazilian judges and justices has been, how can one simplify the procedure or change the procedure so that things happen a little bit more quickly? And of course, we have the same problem in the United States, and in fact, it occurs in every legal system, because you're trying to have a deliberate and careful system at the same time that we know that justice delayed is justice that is also actually denied. So these delays are not good for the system, and it's something that I know judges in Brazil and professors are concerned with. I think this book does an excellent job of describing the procedures as they actually exist. So for people who do not know Brazil well, you can read this book and have a much better sense of how things proceed. It's not just about judges. There's a good description of the prosecutors, even a little bit about the Minister of Justice and the Ministry of Justice. So I think that's extremely helpful. I think it's helpful probably in Portuguese for the Brazilian students who read it, but it's even more helpful in English for the foreigners who read it, because we don't have other training. So it enlightens us. And for that reason, I think that the biographies of the current justices are also useful to have. It gives us a sense of reality, what's actually going on. And it raises a very important point. I think it's a very important point in Brazil, in the United States, everywhere, which is the influence of the courts, the importance of the courts, arises in part because of the quality of the judges. And I think the quality of the judges in Brazil since 1988 has been pretty high. I think Brazil has had good judges. And this book makes it clear, I think, that for the most part, there have been good judges, particularly on the Supreme Court. And I think this adds to their authority. This adds to their authority. But in Brazil, as is true also in the United States, the quality of the judges arises in part from the quality of the broader legal culture. In other words, judges are part of a bigger legal culture that is perpetuated by the universities, by all the different instruments of the state. And Brazilian judges, and I'm not talking now only about the ones at the high levels, but also in other levels of government, they're well-educated and well-intentioned people. The ones I know have impressed me always as being well-educated and well-intentioned people. And this influences the whole society. In other words, the judges on the Supreme Court feel some pressure to live up to the expectations of the other judges and the law professors and the people who constitute the legal culture. And so I think it's very important to maintain this legal culture and this expectation of a certain level of objectivity, a certain level of commitment to legal principles. I think this influences the whole society if the judges can maintain this quality. And I think there's a danger, and you mention it in your book, that when judges make decisions that inevitably sometimes must contradict the actions of popular politicians, there will be a threat to the court, that the popular politicians will seek to undermine, in some way attack the court when they rule against entrenched interests, or even against popular prejudices, because the people too sometimes become excited for things that are not good for the state. And sometimes it is the duty of the judge to say no, either to a very powerful politician or even to popular opinion. And this is a phenomenon where actually both Brazil and the United States recently have felt some pressure There's been a little bit of challenging to the judges from popular politicians. And for judges to survive these moments, their whole history of objectivity and commitment to basic principles and to fundamental human rights, that long-time commitment is what makes it possible to survive in these moments of stress. So I think that Brazil and the United States, both places, have actually got pretty good constitutions. I think Brazil and the United States have got pretty good constitutional principles. And these are important, but they're not enough. We must also have good judges and a good legal culture. And this is what we're fighting for. Professor Vitorelli, this is what your book is helping us to maintain. Professor Galuppo, Professor Vitorelli, really you're heroes in this way, because you help us, you help our students, you help our nations, you help our culture to maintain the standards which it must maintain if we're going to have a just society. So I thank you. I thank our audience today. I think our legal institutions can always get better. And I think we have been making them better, and particularly in Brazil. But we also have to remember that they can also get worse. So we have to fight to maintain these standards, and an independent judiciary committed to democratic and Republican constitutional values, committed to justice, to liberty, and perhaps above all to universal human rights, because it is really the province of judges to protect these things. That is the eternal struggle in Brazil, in the United States, and in everywhere that seeks constitutional government. So that, in my view, is why this is an important book. And that's why I thank you very much, Professor Vitorelli, for this excellent book, and why I'm so pleased to be able to participate with you in this conversation. Thank you.
So, thank you, Professor Sellers. When we hear foreign scholars, I think that we, as Brazilians, should learn to be a little bit more optimistic about our judiciary. So, thank you very much for your considerations.
I just would like to thank you for your very kind words, Professor Sellers. I most surely don't deserve them, but I'm trying to give my little bit of help with this intricate and complex question. So thank you very, very much. Aziz?
Professor Aziz Saliba.
If I may, Professor Galuppo, Professor Galuppo, if I may, I will also
Please
pose a question.
Yes.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Galuppo for organizing this. Would like to thank Professor Vitorelli and Professor Sellers, both for an excellent presentation, excellent comments in the case of Professor Seller, and excellent presentation by Professor Vitorelli. I think it's a terrific idea to produce a book that enlightens a broader audience about perhaps the most relevant organ that we have in the Republic now. And you have done a terrific job. So congratulations on that. And I think this will be an excellent way of helping many people around the world understand Brazil. I do have a little very short comment, and that I can also take this opportunity to pose a couple of questions. There are, of course, similarities between our court and this American Supreme Court. After all, our court was based in the American Supreme Court to a certain extent. There are also some differences. They have minor things like the fact that they have 9 justices, we have 11, that they have, well, we have, sorry, a mandatory retirement here when you are 75. Before it was 70, now 75, you basically have to leave the court. There you can remain as long as you want or as you can. And also as the role in the system, because here, whereas the American Supreme Court is basically an appellate court that hear cases on appeal from federal and state courts, our court also has original jurisdiction in certain cases. Even as an appellate court, I think that in the way that it is, I mean, they're not like the Americans do, carefully picking the cases. It ends like, it's like a game where you decide to play head or tail, but then you play it once. Oh, I don't like it again. No, I don't like it again. No, I don't like it again. No, 4th time. Yeah. So it of course brings a very serious burden on the state and makes the judiciary perhaps less effective. But one striking difference is the level of transparency. I think I don't know any other court in the world that televises its sessions. I mean, every session when you have the full bench, it's fully televised. And sometimes you hear things which you wouldn't imagine that a justice would say to another, which, you know, normally those are the things that make headlines in the following day. And in the US, on the other hand, deliberation is closed. You don't know who said what. You get to hear the opinions. In some cases, like in Germany, you don't even know if, I mean, if there was someone who dissented and so on. It's one decision and that's it. Now, the fact that we have so much media coverage, of course, has its advantages and disadvantages, but what role do you believe that public opinion and media coverage play in shaping the Brazilian Supreme Court's decision-making process and the public perception of its legitimacy? That would be my question. Once again, I would like to congratulate you for the book, for the presentation, and say that it's a privilege to have a colleague who has done such a great job that will promote not only our law school, but also help enlighten one of the most important, if not the most important institution in Brazil nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my dear friend Aziz. I will just say a few words and then I'd like to hear Professor Sellers as well on this one. Well, I think this is the $1,000,000 question, right? What is the right level of transparency for a court to has? Is there, or maybe we can phrase the question as such, is there such a thing as too much transparency? I really don't know. Well, many people, many legal scholars are critics of the TV Justiça and of the broadcasting of the sessions. I'm not. I am mainly, I think mainly this is a good thing. And I think as the old saying would pose, there's no better bleach than the sunlight. So I think we have gained in the last few years from knowing the judges and the justices and knowing what they think and knowing who they are. But on the other hand, there are many justices nowadays, and I know some of them that cannot leave their homes, cannot go to a restaurant, and maybe cannot be here tonight, because if they were, there would be a large crowd and maybe there would be protests. And this is a complicated phenomenon that we are going to have to think about what to do with it. So, and to answer more specifically to your question, I think scientifically, we don't know how much the public opinion weights in the rulings of the court. But I think we all have a subjective perception that it does. I don't know how much it weights. I don't know to which justices it weights more and which justices it weights less. But I think our common perception is that the court is, to some extent, sensible to public opinion and sensible to what the public is thinking. And maybe the best case study about this is the Lava Jato case, that is one of which I talk about in the book, because there was a public perception that was really favorable about the Lava Jato corruption case, and of the idea of trying to clean the corruption from the legislative and the executive. And for some time, the Supreme Court was endorsing all this winds of transformation and saying that, well, everything was fine and let's go, let's do it. And then when the public perception changed, the positions of the court also changed. So the Supreme Court started to be more restrictive about what the Lava Jato was doing and about what the prosecutors was doing. And it's hard to know which one is the egg and which one is the hen. So did the court change because the public changed, or did the public change because the court started to say that what the Lava Jato was doing was wrong? So I think this is a very, very intricate problem. It's hard to measure it scientifically, so it's hard to make research about how much the judges take the public opinion into consideration. But I think this is something that do happen, although we don't know how much it happens, or how many times it happens, or how much it weighs in the rulings of the court. But in general, I think there is no such thing as too much transparency. I think we have to improve transparency, and we have to engage the problems that come with it.
So we have some time for questions. Professor Sellers, any remark?
Well, I was thinking as you were speaking of a visit I once did to the old Supreme Court building in Rio de Janeiro. And they had stained glass windows there. And in the stained glass window, I remember there was Marcus Tullius Cicero, Cicerone, and there was John Marshall. And what that reminded me, and I think reminded the people who argued in that court, is that we have a tradition that is 2,000 years old, that the thing that the court is trying to do is not a new project. It's a project of trying to achieve justice that has been fought for many, many, many years, and in many, many places. And I think that Brazil is very much a part of that tradition. And one of the things I actually would have asked, I suppose, as a question is, having thought so carefully about the structure of institutions in Brazil and of the court, is there something in particular, is there one thing in particular that you think it would be important to alter if it were possible? Or is there a direction you think it would be good to move in, it might be desirable to move in, given the knowledge you have not only of Brazil, but of the whole structure of constitutional courts everywhere?
Well, I don't think I would risk one specific change. They were very complex, and maybe they would pose new challenges. So I would refer to the issue of the day in Brazil. There's a new proposal to amend the constitution, and the main issue of that proposal is to establish a fixed term for the judges, maybe 8 years, maybe 10 years like they do in Europe. So the idea is that as it's happening in the US, the presidents are nominating justices that are younger, and they are staying for too long in our Supreme Court. So they are shaping the law for too long. And of course, what I answer every time someone asks me what I think about this particular change is that we have two organs that are two organs from the judiciary in some sense, which are the National Council of Justice and the National Council for the Prosecution Office, in which there are fixed terms. They are two plus 2 years, and they are quite problematic organs. So the idea of a fixed term will have its problems as well, because the justice is going to begin thinking about what he or she will be after their terms end. So this is a problem as well. Some people are favoring the idea of minimum age. So you only can be a justice if you are 60 or 55, because this the game that's now being played by all our presidents is to nominate someone very, very young. So Lula is going to nominate 2 justices this year, and we will see. But all the bets are on people that are not even 50 years old. So they are probably going to be at the court for at least 25 years from now. And this is maybe not a good thing to happen. And that's exactly what Trump did as well, nominating 3 very young judges. So this is something that we have to think about. But even if, as we tried in '93, monarchy would come back to Brazil and I was chosen to be a king, I wouldn't be so eager to change something because I don't think there are simple answers for these institutional designs that we have to deal with when we're talking about Supreme Courts.
Well, I have a question for the 3 of you. There is I forgot the name. It's not a project, amendment project of our constitution that proposes that Brazilian court be like the German constitutional court. So there will be a 10 years mandate. There is no requirement of age, not for entry, nor for leaving the court, but it's a 10 years mandate. I would ask you, 3 of you, what do you think is the best model for Brazil? Our and American model with no mandate, but a mandatory retirement at 75 years old, or 10 years mandate, like German constitutional court. What do you think, you and Tim and Aziz?
Well, to say just one phrase, I would favor minimum age over fixed terms. So I would prefer if the judges were only able to be nominated at 60, so they would have 15 years until 75. This would be my preferred, from the top of my head, my preferred idea. Because they were going to live very old. And so they would not have much time after they leave the court to be a former Supreme Court justice lawyer. So I think this to have too many young former Supreme Court justices, lawyering in Brazil would be bad for our legal system, because they would have too much power as a lawyer. So I think from 60 to 75 would be my preferred. Minimum 60 and maximum 75, so 15 years.
What do you think, Tim?
Well, we have, of course, got a very similar problem in the United States, and it's almost impossible for us to change. So we can only talk in theory about what would be good. But I agree that it would be undesirable to have people having a very significant career as lawyers, in particular, after having been on the Supreme Court. Partly because you would worry that they might be influenced whilst they were still on the court by the thoughts of their next employment, and that would be not desirable. On the other hand, I also think that it might be desirable to have a fixed length of time for these terms. And the reason for that is you wouldn't have the problem that we have in the United States, where chance can determine how many judges a politician gets to appoint. If there was a regular rotation, then each president would appoint the same number of judges. And I think that would lead to a more balanced court. But I do think there would I too would favor some kind of minimum age, I think, and certainly some restrictions on the sorts of employment that are open to former Supreme Court judges. I think the most natural one is to be a professor. If you still have some years left, to be a professor is not a threat to anybody, but it could be very beneficial to the world. So I think I mostly agree with you, but I would like to have a fixed term if it were possible.
Well, I think, as I've said before, everything in life has its advantages and disadvantages. So there are certain, we can of course point some positive and negative aspects of having or not having a term. But I outweighing everything, I think that, I mean, whereas the term is an instrument of limitation of power, right? Senators, they have a term. House representatives, they have a term. A president has a term. I think that the situation of the judge is a bit different. I mean, whereas politicians, they have a certain term, but they are more likely to be evaluated on a periodical basis. They can be voted out of office, right? But I mean, if the public is overall is happy with their performance, they may be kept there. I mean, that's the logic of the system. But judges, they, on the other hand, they need a certain guarantee to go against the current. You may have certain decisions that are very, very unpopular. You may have certain decisions that will be quite controversial. And I mean, as we study law here, we learn that people have points of view that are completely different. And as far as you discuss many issues, many controversial issues with your classmates, you get some very, very different answers. So I think that I would be very concerned with the term for the judges, because then it ends, then they are young, they'll serve as lawyers, and I think that's not a good idea, right? Of course, we could offer them a retirement, but it doesn't make much sense to offer someone who is, say, I don't know, 50 years old, very generous retirement in a country that has many social issues like Brazil. So I like the age idea a lot better. I think that as a rule, as we get older, we get to be a little bit more prudent, right? But again, that also does not solve one of the problems that we have in Brazil, which is that almost every justice that has retired from the Supreme Court has opened a law firm. I can't think of an exception right now. There is, but I can't remember right now any exceptions to that rule. And as Professor Sellers has pointed, that's quite concerning. And then the person is getting the best of both systems for him, not for the country. He has a guarantee that is offered for him because he may need to be controversial or unpopular, but he also has the advantages of the market. I have friends at the court. I've been there. I know how people think. Well, you can hire my law firm. And of course, I still have my generous retirement, right? So I think that, we would need other things which are not on the table right now in Brazil. So the concern here is a political concern. Are we giving justices at the Supreme Court mostly? Are we giving justice too much power? That's the concern. And that's the reason that we have this debate. So it's not about making the system better. And that's a problem.
Right. So we have some time for questions. Please, you speak on.
Em primeiro momento, vou jogar a pergunta de volta para você. Essa pergunta deve ser feita em inglês ou português? Well, Professor Vitarelli has said that our Supreme Court has taken some decisions based on public opinion. Here in Brazil, we have a growing movement against the Supreme Court caused by the conservative and right wing of Brazil. So isn't the Supreme Court taking these political decisions based on public opinion out of fear of a revolution or attack to the institution? Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think it's hard to say. As I said, it's difficult to measure how much the public opinion weighs on the minds of each justice. But I think they have some weight. It has some weight. It's difficult to say how much, but it has. And also, I think I'm also optimistic about the institutions in general and the future of our institutions. But I'm also concerned with cases just like we had in Poland, in Hungary. So there is a new conservative right-wing movement worldwide that's targeting Supreme Courts because Supreme Courts are unelected bodies that can decide against these majorities when they reach the power. So although I am optimistic in general, I think the price of liberty is eternal surveillance. So we will have to be vigilant about what's happening to our Supreme Court. And also it's problematic because you can pressure the Supreme Court from the outside with the public opinion, but presidents can also change it from the inside. So differently from what happened in the US, where they had rejections of the confirmation processes in the Senate, the last ones that were rejected for the Brazilian Supreme Court were appointed by Floriano Peixoto more than 100 years ago. So the Senate basically confirms everyone, even you and me, if we were appointed. So it's likely that a strong president with a little bit of luck, if he or she gets to appoint 4, maybe 5 justices in 2 terms, and very young justices, he or she could change the face of the court for many, many years. So think about what would have happened if Bolsonaro was re-elected. So he has already appointed 2 justices. He would have the chance to appoint at least 2 more, so 4. Maybe someone's going to die, so 5, and then it's really a new court. It's basically a new court, and that's the luck Trump had in the US in just 1 term to appoint 3 justices. So a third of the court is now a Trump court, and it's causing many discussions in the US as well. So courts are, I think, sensitive bodies because they can be pressured from the outside, but they can also be changed from the inside, and both aspects of this problem are concerning.
Another question I would like to hear from you, the 3 of you, is about the nomination procedure. Is the American or the Brazilian, they are very alike, procedure the best one for nominating the justices? What do you think?
Well, by comparison, and considering what we have in Brazil at the National Council of Justice and National Council of the Prosecution Office, I would say yes, by comparison, because the other 2 are awful. So the horror, they are terrible, and they tend to appoint people that are really, well, problematic, I would say. So by comparison, I would say yes. But ideally, I think if we had a legislature that is more prone to be responsible and to be more accountable to the people, I think I believe you were thinking about the German nomination process. I think it would be theoretically a better idea, but empirically, we have this model for the National Council of Justice, and I don't think it works very well.
Professor Sellers.
It's hard to say because in a well-functioning republic, the control of the Senate would be very helpful. And in the United States, we used to have a tradition of requiring a 2/3 vote. And in those years, we had a lot of consensus between the parties on judges. There was a consensus about what a good judge looked like, and there was a consensus in the appointment process. Recently, we have, first of all, departed from that consensus and then departed from the customary rule of 2/3. So these judges, the recent judges, we call them the Trump judges, were selected by a very small, narrow majority. And as a result, they're not really representative of any kind of broad consensus. So I liked our system when it was working. Now it's not working so well. I don't like it as well. I think it has to do a little bit with the culture of the lawyers. And if the lawyers collectively, when I was younger, I felt there was a strong culture among lawyers where the political party actually did not play such a large role in the point of view of a judge. There was a strong legal point of view that was united against both, extremes on both parties. Now it seems that we have some new theories of law that are a little bit outside the normal, and some judges get appointed to have those theories. So we have a less coherent system. I will say one thing that I think would be a very bad system, which is the system we have in many of our states, which is to elect the judges. That's something that I think is a very poor way to choose judges. So some of the United States have got, I think, even worse systems than our federal system. And just related a little bit to our earlier discussion about terms, I think it's very important that the term not be renewable. In other words, whatever term you have should be a fixed term that ends. Because if it's renewable, then it will color the activities of the judge who is concerned for their reappointment. And of course, this is what's also wrong with the elected judges. They try to appeal to the voters rather than paying attention to the Constitution or to justice. So I think our system used to work pretty well. At the moment, it's not. Maybe it's because we need to get back to having supermajorities for the confirmation of justices.
Well, both times I asked Marcelo to be the last one to answer, because then I could just say that I agree with both of them, and because I was certain they would provide us with some very good answers. What I would say is that the system works very well if the people in it work well. I mean, you depend a lot on the political actors that are making the decision and the factors that they are weighing in. So Professor Sellers has just described for example, the American Senate. We can say the same about the Brazilian Senate. I mean, here, as Professor Vitorelli has pointed out, it's basically, basically you look at the number of votes that the person will get, but you are almost sure, if not sure, that he or she will be approved by the Senate. There's only one exception in history, which is someone who had an undergraduate degree in medicine, Barata Ribeiro. He was not confirmed. That's an exception to the rule, which, as people like to say here, confirms the rule, right? But the thing is, any other system that if we decide to replace this system with another one for choosing the justices, it will keep on depending on the goodwill of the actors. And you just change where things can go wrong or with whom things can go wrong. That's how I see it. If the president and the Senate cannot get it right, I don't think that, other actors, other political actors have a much better chance of getting it right.
So we have another question, 2 questions. So you have to speak on the microphone.
Thanks for the opportunity. And I would like to ask about, on a civil law point of view, do you 4 professors think the adoption of the system of precedents in the Brazilian Supreme Court is healthy for the Brazilian legal system?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. I talk a little bit about it in the book, and this is a theme that concerns me here at our law school. I have a course on precedents in civil law. Many of you have been my students at that course. And well, again, not to take too long to talk about it, but I think overall, this is a good thing. So I think, of course, as is very nicely put, all institutional designs have to trust people. So it's impossible to build an institutional design that's so good that it will operate well regardless of who is operating it. So yes, we depend on people, but overall, I think our strengthening of a culture of precedents in the last 2 decades, I would say, but especially in the last decade, is a good, interesting, positive movement for our country, especially because we have too many lawsuits. And before we had this culture of precedents, it was very common to have different results from different cases, even though they were the same. So I think it's positive. It has many, 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 many problems that I take a semester to debate, but it is, I think, overall, something good that's happening to us. And it's interesting to think how open we have been to this culture of precedents, differently, for example, from the French or from the Italians, who are much more closed and much more, well, bothered with this new input of precedents on their systems. We have been embracing this new developments in these last few years. And again, although they have many problems, we have many problems to solve. I think overall, this is a good thing.
Professor Sellers.
When I was in Brazil in the 90s, this was really a big topic then, and I suppose it is still a big topic now, but there have been a lot of moves towards greater precedent. If you're going to have a system which recognizes the importance of principles and general rules, then you probably need to have precedent if you want to maintain any kind of legal certainty. Because otherwise you could get a lot of, you end up having very diverse decisions and you don't get very much consistency. The danger of precedent, like the danger of codes, is that if it is too rigid, then you're unable to deal with the changing circumstances. So one of the things that you really have to study as you accept a system of precedent is what are the rules for departing from precedent? But I think that reasoned departures from precedent can be quite helpful. So speaking now from much less knowledge of Brazil, but just in general, of knowledge of the world and certain European countries, I think that if you're going to have principles as we must, then you also kind of need to have precedent to make the principles more honest.
Well, I don't want to take long. What I would just add to the excellent comments that my colleagues have already put here to you is that I think that the most realistic outcome that we can expect from courts is foreseeability. We normally tend to think about justice, but that's not the most realistic output that we can expect from courts. And in that sense, the precedent system, I think, adds to the design, to the quality of the design of the institution.
So we have time for one more question, two more questions, please.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Adilson, for your book, and also greet all the professors here. I'm so happy to be here in this joyful occasion. Well, I think most of the variables of my question have already been addressed somehow, but I still want to ask it. If we think about comparatively about a common law system and a civil law system, do you think that the justices should be more or less actively concerned about the backlash effect of their decisions? I mean, I'm not talking about bias that comes from that decision, but like being actively concerned about that. Does that make a difference if the system is a common law one or a civil law one?
Thank you, Thais. It's very nice to see you again. We will be together for a very long time this week, so it's nice to have you back here in Brazil. Well, I have not thought about it very long, but I think you are exposed to backlash in both civil law and common law countries. So actually, the difference between the system, as Professor Sellers has pointed out, is not that great nowadays. So, for example, when the Supreme Court was more conservative in the 90s, then the Congress in the US passed the 1991 Civil Rights Act to overrule many of the court's rulings in that last few years. Here in Brazil, we have one case that I talk about in the book, which is the Vaquejada case, in which a popular party was outlawed by the court, and a month and a half later, the Congress passed a constitutional amendment to bring the party back on. So it is, I think nowadays the systems, as Professor Sellers has said, are converging, and so backlash is a risk against the rulings of the court, regardless of what is the position of the original position of the country, if it's a civil law country or a common law country.
Professor Sellers?
Yeah, the difference between the common law and civil law is interesting as you go, way back into history. And I'm not sure what the relevant difference is now. There was an old principle in the times of the emperors, quod principi placuit legis habet valorem. In other words, the idea that what the prince likes, that is the law. I think that's present. So some civil law jurisdictions and some civil law philosophers are still more wedded to what you might call legal positivism than would be typical in common law jurisdictions. So I think there is some stronger conception of the power of the sovereign still in some civil law jurisdictions. If I was trying to find a contemporary difference that I experience when I talk to people in different jurisdictions, that might be the one. I think there's a stronger strain of legal positivism, but it by no means universal, because you also have a stronger strain of use naturalism in some civil law jurisdictions. So it's not a universal thing, but that might be one small thing that I still do sometimes notice.
Well, I would just perhaps tell a very short story to say that that will show that I agree with both colleagues here, which is I got my LLM in the United States 23 years ago, more or less. And since then, I've seen the differences between common law and civil law decrease. And of course, when you talk about common law, you were talking about a very broad family, a very large family, a very broad range of different systems. I mean, you have common law in the US, but you have common law in India, you have common law in the UK, you have common law, Nigeria and so on. And it's not, or in New Zealand, and it's not to say that these are all the same, but many of the central tenets of both systems have integrated into each other. For example, one important difference that I had in mind was that they did not have codes in common law countries. That's not, true, at least to a very large extent. Well, that we don't have a precedent system, not in the same way that they have, but we do take precedents into consideration. And every time we are doing it more and more. So I think that in terms of backlashes, for example, it's not going to make much difference whether you have one system or the other, frankly.
So last but not least, Jessica, our last question.
Well, thank you very much. Well, as you were mentioning, how it's hard to follow the decisions of the Supreme Court, and it kind of also dialogues with the question of precedents, because I have the feeling that's not just because we have a lot of decisions, but because we have a system that's composed by many possibilities of having decisions. We have monocratic decisions, we have collegiate decisions, and on and on. And do you think that, well, is it really a problem of number of cases, or we should actually improve or think about a way to reinforce the way the court has or establishes precedent? Because, and also that also goes in the direction of each judge having its own reasons, because we cannot form a majority by accident. Like, well, I'm in favor for whichever reason that may be, and at the end we have, well, the majority in one direction, but we also don't have like an understanding of the court. And when I try to explain that, for example, with the Germans, they get totally confused, especially in that case, in which we discussed the possibility of imprisonment after the second decision, collegiate decision. I mean, it's basically impossible to explain how many opportunities to decide the court had. So how could that be solved in some kind of design, or at least get easier to understand?
Thank you for this very interesting question, Jessica. Well, your question presents us with the main challenges of having precedent. So if you have a system that values precedent, you have to, first of all, decide what constitutes a precedent. Then how are you going to rule to form a precedent? And then how you are going to apply that precedent. So a threefold process that you have to acknowledge. I think our Code of Civil Procedure Code was wise when it decided on Article 97 that not everything the Supreme Court says is a binding precedent. Not everything our superior court says is a binding precedent. So let's choose just specific rulings that are deliberated more carefully and that more justices take part in. So, for example, the panels of our Supreme Court, even though they are panels of the Supreme Court, do not form binding precedents. So that's an option, a complicated one, but I think a correct one, because otherwise we would have too many precedents and it would be unmanageable because we would have too many precedents. So I think this was a wise decision from our legislature. On a second part of your question, I think the quantity is really a problem. I have had the opportunity to talk about the people that work at the organs that now exist, both on the Supreme Court and on the Superior Court, that are in charge of managing precedents, which is the NUGEP. NUGEP is the new organ that has been created to manage precedents inside the court. And what these people told me is that they are losing control. So it's really hard for them, because we are now getting to 1,000 binding precedents on the Supreme Court just on general repercussion, and the constitutional original jurisdiction lawsuits, and also the binding summaries. And then we have another 1,000 ones in the Superior Court. So they think they are losing control, and they are trying to create tools to work with it. And mostly what I have been seeing in these last few years are IT tools. So they are trying to build databases and searchable bases and AI tools that can identify cases to be cases to create a precedent and cases to which the precedent can be applied. So that's what's going on. They are really the people that work on the courts are concerned that they're going to lose control. In 10 years more, we are probably going to have 2,000 general repercussion and 2,000 repetitive cases on the STJ, and this is probably going to be a problem someday. I was personally scared when the Supreme Court acknowledged general repercussion on the theme 1075, which was the reach of the collective res judicata, without even mentioning the 715 general repercussion theme, which dealt exactly with the same thing. And I think they forgot. I really think they forgot. They didn't say it because it was just a phrase. Oh, we had the general repercussion 715, but that's okay. They didn't even looked at it. So I think they really are running now on some risks that they may forget a case. And this is going to be a concern in this next few years when we have so many precedents being formed each year.
Professor Sellers.
Maybe I should let my colleague Aziz go first.
This time I have nothing to add. I think here, Professor Vitorelli is the best person to talk about this because it's a much more, I think that any answer will have much more to do with procedural law and than with anything that I can add here.
So now I can agree with Aziz that the first answer was very full and complete and informed. But I will take this opportunity since I think this was the last question. And I believe I even know the questioner, Jessica. We have met before, I think. And to say what a pleasure and honor it is for me to be associated with such learned colleagues in Brazil, and particularly in your university. And that I remember with great pleasure the times I have visited there in person. And I really look forward to working with you again in the future. I am so impressed and delighted to have the opportunity to be on a panel with you.
Okay, so final remarks.
Well, Marcelo, I just would very much like to thank you and thank you, Professor Sellers, for this remarkable opportunity to be here and to discuss my book. This is a fascinating theme, and I think we are going to talk about this for many years to come. So thank you all very much.
Professor Sellers.
I think I already gave my comment, which is that I applaud you very much. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that it was a pleasure to share this panel with Professor Vitorelli, Professor Sellers, Professor Galuppo. I would like to thank Professor Galuppo for organizing this and congratulate Professor Vitorelli for the presentation, for the book, and also thank Professor Sellers for participating in this and in other activities at our school. I take this opportunity, Professor Sellers, to say that that we are always very glad to have you with us. So thank you.
So I think that this was a very fruitful night. I have learned a lot. I have enjoyed a lot to be with you, to learn with you. I want to thank to Edilson Vitorelli, Mortimer Sellers, and Aziz Saliba for coming, for joining us. And we hope that we can have more seminars and panels like this. We will try to organize some more this year. Thank you very much to all. Thank you, Tim, for coming, for joining us.
Goodbye, my friends.